Excavating the life of an archaeologist, how Heinrich Schliemann invented Troy. A film written by Annick Louis, directed by Momoko Seto. The name of Heinrich Schliemann calls to mind the extraordinary destiny of a child who dreamed of discovering the site of the ancient city of Troy. His passion was born of the tales told by his father, a Protestant pastor who related the exploits of Homer's heroes. His family's financial difficulties prevented the young Schliemann from studying. He had to begin working at a grocery at age 14. When he reached adulthood, he made his fortune in commerce, first in Russia, where he sold various commodities, and then in California, at the time of the gold rush, where he operated a bank, and finally back in Russia during the Crimean War through the sale of indigo, which was used to dye soldiers' uniforms. Compelled by his childhood dream, he abandoned the world of commerce at the age of 44 and threw himself into archaeology, a change of life that will make him the most famous archaeologist of all time. Finding the site of the ancient city of Troy would mean proving that historical truth exists behind the Iliad, that the fiction is based on events that really took place. Traditionally, the two sites considered to correspond potentially to the city of King Priam were Hissarlik and Bunabashi, situated in northwest Turkey. Schliemann's fervor and zeal enabled him quickly to prove that Hissarlik was the site of the ancient city of Troy. At the end of his first excavation campaign in May 1873, he discovered the treasure of Troy, also called the treasure of Priam. Some years later, Schliemann endeavored to discover the tombs of the king of Mycenae in Greece, including Agamemnon, the victor of the Trojan War. He also unearthed the famous golden masks, one of which he identified with the face of Agamemnon. At the moment when he changed his life, Schliemann justified his passion for knowledge and his delayed interest in archaeology in an autobiography that he published before his first real excavation campaigns. This is where the scene of the child who dreamed of Troy first appears. From the moment of its publication, this scene has struck the public's imagination, causing the passion for knowledge to emerge in people who did not appear fated to devote themselves to it, whether by their social origins, lack of education, or absence of opportunities. This autobiography has enjoyed huge success since its initial publication in 1869. It contains another element that sparked the public's enthusiasm, the teach-yourself method for learning languages that Schliemann devised. This method, which allowed him to learn more than 12 languages by himself, consisted of reading a novel in a familiar language, then in an unknown language, and writing short stories without ever making translations. He thus learned English, Spanish, Italian, Turkish, ancient and modern Greek, Latin, Dutch, Russian, French, and several other languages, and it was this mastery of many languages that allowed him to make a fortune in commerce. This fascinating life story was regarded as true for around 100 years. In the 1970s, a series of historians and archaeologists called it into question. They proved that practically everything that Schliemann told about his life had been invented. Doubt was then cast on his archaeological discoveries as well, making people think that they were fakes. For example, in his diary, he recounts at length his meeting with US President Millard Fillmore on February 21, 1851, which is completely made up, since Schliemann was not even at the White House on that day. Certain objects, such as the head of Cleopatra, which he affirmed had been found during excavations, had in fact been purchased from merchants. The circumstances in which he obtained his divorce in 1869 were also falsified. He declared he had lived in Indianapolis for a year and altered translations of letters from his wife to justify his claim for divorce. And finally, if we consider the difficult relationship that he had always had with his father, and take into account some of the letters exchanged with his half-brother, and the fact that no trace of interest in archaeology exists before he reached the age of 40, we can ask if the scene of the child who dreamed of Troy is not also a fiction. His autobiography was thus first considered true, then rejected entirely as falsehood. Not until the time of the centenary of his death was a new assessment offered. Today, it allows us to acknowledge his contributions to the discipline of archaeology and also frees us from his autobiographical account. As a literary researcher, it was not the fact that Schliemann's writings, autobiographical or archaeological, were true or false that interested me, but that they are narratives. I asked myself, what truth does Schliemann narrative tell us, even when it is not truthful? And also, how do his narratives work? How can their variants be explained? Because when I arrived in Athens, at the Gennadius Library of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, where the Schliemann archives are located, I learned that actually 4 different versions of his autobiography exist. This fact is known to specialists, but not to the general public. The first was written in English and remained unpublished during his lifetime. It predates his career as an archaeologist, but already contains his teach-yourself method of learning languages. The second autobiography is in reality part of the preface to his first scholarly work, Ithaque, le Péloponnèse étroit, and was written in French. The third is presented as an autobiography. It comes at the beginning of his book Ilios, which assesses 10 years of excavation campaigns at Troy and was written in English. The fourth was written in German after his death, from fragments of the preceding versions and some other documents. Historians and archaeologists have utilized these narratives as sources, or to highlight their contradictions and variants. By taking an interest in the narrative, I realized that the scene of the child who dreams of Troy has a twofold function. It tells the birth of Schliemann's calling, but passes over his education in complete silence. The scene of the child who dreams of Troy is so resonant that the reader does not even ask, how did this businessman in his 40s become an archaeologist? This is the question that I ask myself. To answer it, I have tried to reconstruct his itinerary and began to follow his footsteps through the archives. In 1864, he sold his business and took a long voyage into the Orient, which he recounts in his first published book, La Chine et le Japon au temps présent. And then he returned to Europe, visited England, then arrived finally in Paris. He invested in real estate at the moment when Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann were modernizing the city, which thus became the capital of the 19th century. Schliemann settled into Paris more and more. This Parisian period, which stretched from 1866 to 1870, has not really been studied. In his case, there is something else. From his very first days in the French capital, he attended classes and lectures, at the Collège de France, at the Sorbonne as well. He also began to spend time at learned societies, such as the Paris Geographical Society and the Society of Ethnography, and then attended the meetings of the Academy of Inscriptions and Literature. In this period, classes and lectures at institutions of higher learning in France, especially in Paris, were attended by a broad swath of the public. The university had very few degree-seeking students, but numerous individuals came to listen to learned men, for self-improvement, for pleasure, or simply to be seen. In this varied environment, a rich businessman without any university degrees could feel at ease and be introduced to learning. Thanks to the classes that he attended, he formed relationships with scholars of the period, particularly with the Hellenist Émile Egas, professor at the Sorbonne. Egas sponsored him, read over his manuscripts, and helped him to become part of the scholarly world, which was fashionable in the Second Empire, and where personal and familiar relationships remained vital. A marriage was even considered between Schliemann's half-brother Ernst, a wine merchant in Bordeaux, and Egas' daughter. Schliemann took part in his salons and those of his father-in-law, Félix Désiré d'Eck, also a Hellenist, where he made the acquaintance of personalities of the period, such as the historian Ernest Renan. He met others at the gatherings of learned societies, such as Charles Monnoir, Secretary General of the Société de Géographie, and Vladimir Brunet de Perle, Hellenist and historian. 1869 was a pivotal year in Schliemann's life. He published his first scholarly book, which contained his autobiography. He also obtained a doctorate from the University of Rostock by presenting this book together with a translation of its preface into ancient Greek and Latin. He divorced his first wife, Ekaterina Petrovna Lishin, daughter of a Russian merchant whom he had married in 1852, and with whom he had 3 children. His wife had remained in Russia and refused to follow him to Paris. He then married a young Greek girl, aged 17, Sophia Engastromenos, with whom he would have 2 children named Andromache and Agamemnon. Schliemann gave Sophia an education and was to create an imaginary character, a learned woman who at the same time called Helen of Troy to mind, thereby bestowing official status on her participation in archaeology, though that remains dubious. But this is how he constructed the image of a harmonious couple who lived in and for science, because that is one of the models that Schliemann retained from the Parisian environment. To devote himself to science, he had to have the support of a woman. Indeed, the educated daughters, sisters, and wives of the scholars of the period were crucial presences in the salons, and as far as known, did part of the work. Despite his integration into the Parisian environment, Schliemann's first findings about the site of Troy and his hypotheses concerning the site of the city would be the target of vehement rejection in France. For scholars were attached to the Bunabashi hypothesis and to the philological method, in other words, to comparisons between the topography of the Troad and the text of Homer. Excavations were not considered capable of furnishing conclusive proof. None of his interpretations of the archaeological artifacts that were found were accepted in France. But his opponents were not always wrong either, because the elements were still lacking that would allow for the interpretation of Schliemann's findings, as he was in the process of bringing an unknown civilization to light. We could hypothesize that the French academic world had difficulty accepting his transition from amateur to man of learning, in contrast to other countries. In this period, the second half of the 19th century, amateurs were allowed into the realm of science, but only as providers of objects, whereas learned men kept the field of interpretation to themselves. But the Franco-Prussian War, which ended in France's defeat, also contributed to make Schliemann, who was originally from northern Germany, a stranger in the circles he had once frequented. Schliemann then gradually gave up his aspiration to belong to the French intellectual world. He built an international career, in part by publishing daily reports of his excavations in American and German newspapers. As a researcher, I have also wondered about the variants that the 4 autobiographies present. For example, in the 3rd autobiography, Schliemann summarizes and develops the scenes presented in Ithac, but he adds something else. He claims to have grown up surrounded by fantastic medieval legends that he believed in. He also thought that the treasures spoken of in these legends of his native land could be rediscovered. These anecdotes seem to have been inspired by a book on the legends of his native Mecklenburg, and were introduced by Schliemann to corroborate the mechanisms that he employed in connection with Troy. Behind the Homeric text, a historic city was to be found. He thought that the treasures of which the legend spoke could be rediscovered, but he also introduces them to prove that his interest in archaeology came before the discovery of the Homeric narrative. In other words, this 3rd autobiography separates his passions for archaeology from his love of the world of Homer. In the 4th and last version of the autobiography, Alfred Brückner, a German archaeologist who had worked with Schliemann at the end of his life, opposes imagination to science. According to him, while imagination had led him to science in the first place, once Schliemann had begun to work as an archaeologist, this same imagination led him astray and to propose erroneous hypotheses. Yet Schliemann had inserted his autobiography into his scholarly works because this childhood narrative legitimizes his vocation. By separating autobiography from archaeological narrative, Brückner underscored the exemplary character of Schliemann's life, but concealed his scholarly contribution. Autobiographies, archives, and published works have thus allowed me to grasp the logic of his writing. Initially, writing in different languages in his diary, Schliemann reworks texts written by others and introduces himself as the main character. He thereby becomes the hero of stories and of fragments of stories lived and recounted by others. Homer, his cousin, newspaper articles, anonymous correspondence, a book of legends. These stories were taken over and transformed by Schliemann to create his own life and scholarly career. He constructed a life made of fragments taken over from others, and conceals his own private self. In the end, we do not really know his life. His narratives, autobiographical and otherwise, are not truthful, since they do not tell what he experienced, but they are not fictional either, since they tell events experienced by others and borrowed by Schliemann. His writing thus creates a certain stickiness and fascination. And even if we consider that he did not become an archaeologist because he dreamed of Troy as a child, his story makes us dream even today. Because when he was over 40, he made a radical change in his life, driven by a passion for knowledge, and because he spread the idea that behind the legends there is a truth to be discovered, which has been utilized by numerous authors, writers, and movie directors. The principal hypothesis around which all my research has been organized can be defined thus: it is through and thanks to the narrative that Schliemann becomes an archaeologist. A movie based on the book The Invention of Troy, The Dreamed Lives of Heinrich Schliemann by Annick Louis.